this episode, we would like to say that in the spirit of reconciliation, that we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to the land, sea and community.
Welcome back to another episode of Spaghettification. Today we have Dwayne Hamacher. Dwayne is an Associate Professor of Cultural Astronomy in the ARC Centre of Excellence in All-Sky Astrophysics 3D Dimensions, Astro 3D, and the School of Physics at Melbourne University. Duane researches cultural astronomy, dark sky studies, astronomical heritage, and the history and philosophy of science, and wrote the trade book, The First Astronomers, How Indigenous Elders Read the Stars. Not read the stars, read the stars. Is that right? Read? I got it right this time?
Yeah, it's absolutely right. Read the stars. Present tense.
Present tense. Welcome to Spaghettification, Duane.
Thank you so much for having me on.
That's all right. Now, I'm going to ask the first question, and it's something I noticed I noticed it on your Facebook, and then it got clarified when you moved out of the way. You have drums in the background. I'm guessing you're a drummer, and if so, is it true that drummers are the smartest member of any band?
I feel it would be a supreme arrogance to say a factual statement like that in front of the rest of my bandmates.
I said it for you. It's okay.
Yes, I am a drummer. I've been playing drums since I was about 16, and it's something I really enjoy. And we have our roles in the bands, right? I think drummers are often very much underestimated, but we're not quite as dumb as we make ourselves out to be. But we are the butt of a great many jokes. For example, do you know how you know if the drum riser is level?
How?
If the drummer drools out of both sides of his mouth.
I like that. I used to play drums at school. That's about as far as it went. I used to smash the old Pearl Export drum kit in the back room at home from about 4 or 5 years. I was never very good at it, though.
Well, I've only gotten marginally better since I was 16. But yeah, I still playing a Pearl as well. You know, time to get a DW, time to get a good one, but in time.
Now we have Steffi with us today. How are you going, Steffi?
I'm doing great. I have had a busy day of work, and I'm really excited to get to chat to Duane today. So, Duane, we've been colleagues at the University of Melbourne for a few years now, but one thing I've never really gotten to ask you is about how you got into the field that you got into. And everyone who does physics has that story of, they did like a research project and they were like, this is amazing. This is what I want to do like my research on. So you have a clear passion for Indigenous astronomy. Where did that come from, and how did you make that into your career in astronomy?
I think for me, it stemmed when I was a kid. I didn't get into astronomy through a research project as much as I did I was 4, I guess. I just became obsessed with all things astronomy.
Yeah.
What was it, 1982? I was 4 when E.T. came out, and that was like my favorite movie. I was obsessed. I just became obsessed with anything space, anything dinosaurs, and anything archaeology. For me, the ultimate trilogy is Indiana Jones, despite how terrible archaeologist he actually is. It just gives you that sort of passion. So I grew up with this love and this passion for science, and particularly I grew up with a passion for astronomy and archaeology.
Yeah.
Growing up like a tiny little town in the middle of nowhere, mid-Missouri, was quite, a challenge. You didn't have any role models. There were no astronomers around.
Yeah.
You didn't have people like that you could see in action. And, it wasn't an environment where you chose that kind of thing. I don't know. I've been watching the TV show Ozarks, which is pretty much where I grew up. Yeah. It's really strange watching Ozark. I'm like, I recognize everything in here, Mm-hmm. But, when I got to the point where I wanted to go to university, I went to my guidance counselor and asked, what programs they have in astronomy. And all she could find was like stuff at like Berkeley and Caltech and Harvard. My chances of getting into any of those universities were, I'd have better luck winning the lottery. Mm-hmm. But I actually enrolled in a degree doing biology and geology and switched over to physics my second year when I realized that's what I needed to do. Yeah. So long story short, I got really into the topic of astronomy. Yeah. It took me a very long time to get my undergrad degree because of that. But what got me into Indigenous astronomy was just an experience that I had when I came to Australia as a study abroad student. Now, when I was in the U.S., before that, I'd been getting interested in this world of archaeoastronomy, and I was looking at stuff in ancient Sumeria and places. But when I came to Australia as a study abroad student at Macquarie, it was August 2003, and Mars was at its closest approach to the Earth in tens of thousands of years. So I went to the observatory with one of the other study abroad students. And I asked about Aboriginal star knowledge, and I got a vile and dismissive response. I never could quite figure out why that was the case, and went back to the States and just became obsessed with Australia. And I wanted to come back here. And when I came back, I decided to make that my career. Yeah, it was a lot of fun because when the tiny school I went to, my class was really small, and they gave out awards in each of the subjects every year. And for like 6 years in a row, I won the science award. Well, I missed out in sixth grade because, thanks Katie Schaefer, she beat me on that. But I also, funnily enough, several years won the social studies award. But funnily enough, didn't seem to care about that. I was just adamant about getting the science award. But it demonstrated that I had this love and passion for the social sciences, history, archaeology, geography, all these kinds of areas. And when I came to Australia, I was doing astrophysics. I wasn't even doing cultural astronomy at all. I just kept getting drawn to that question about why is it people are so dismissive of Aboriginal astronomy. And when I began looking into that, I saw tons of science, tons of astronomy there, and I thought, well, if nobody else is going to do this, I will. And it just drew my interest more than astrophysics did at the time.
Yeah.
So I left my PhD program in astro, did a master's degree, and then went off to do Indigenous Astronomy, and I've been doing that for 14 years now.
On the topic of Indigenous Astronomy, since we're talking about it, it wasn't meant to be the next question, but we'll go there anyway, because it sort of flows through nicely. You're talking about there's not many people that, well, there wasn't many, and there probably still isn't many people who cover those areas on this topic. But what's the most exciting part of Indigenous Astronomy then? Like, what was it that really drew you in from an Indigenous astronomy aspect? Like, is it the stories? Like, what part of it really sold it to you?
I've always found the intersection of astronomy and culture, any culture, quite fascinating. How do people understand the stars? How do cultures apply that knowledge? What kinds of observations and tools do they use to try to understand the movements and motions of stars? And, learning about how you can read the very subtle changes in the properties and positions of stars is quite enlightening. This is an area that, even though I knew a bit about astrophysics, I had my undergrad, my master's degree in that area, it was still something I didn't know that much about. The going outside and the positional astronomy, looking with your own eyes, not just focusing on the physics of stuff, but actually standing outside, looking up at the sky, which I did quite a lot as a kid growing up out in the country. And down here, these are very different stars, very different skies to what I grew up knowing. And I found that it was an opportunity for me to touch upon all the different areas that I found fascinating. And I found that I was much better at that than I was astrophysics, quite frankly. But with the knowledge of astrophysics, I get to learn about everything else. I get to learn about biology and geology and meteorology, all the other sciences. I get to learn about all the social sciences and humanities, because the information that I work with is derived from historical records, from elders living now, from material archaeological sites, from everything. And then that ties in with so many other areas, with music and oral tradition and art. And it feels like there's no area of academia that doesn't touch on the work that I'm doing in some way. And as somebody who can be a bit ADHD, it gives me a chance to touch on all the different things. I mean, it comes at a cost because you tend to lack that narrow disciplinary depth like you would if you just work in one area only. Mm-hmm. But I love what I do.
I hear you on that front. A little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit over there. Oh, that's exciting. I want to focus on that now. Oh, here's something else that branches up from what I just learned about. Yeah, no, it's
exactly right.
It's fun though when you find something you're interested in, like you have with Indigenous astronomy, and then there are all these other little areas off it that you go, oh, hang on, that's really cool too. Oh no, that one, and then there's just so much to learn. Obviously,
I think especially in an area where there hasn't been any mainstream interest in academia in looking into the topic, like being the first one to be like, what about this is interesting to me today. Like I can get something absolutely new, just like talking to one new person or something. That sounds really amazing.
It is, and it's something that changed quite a bit over a few years. Because when I first came in, I was very naive. I didn't know that much about it, and it was just whatever topics interested me, I would start looking into. And then as I was being mentored by a couple of elders, I started learning more about the importance and the power behind this knowledge, and that this isn't just floating around free for the taking. So I had to gain a new perspective and a deep respect for the knowledge in a way that if I was going to approach it, why was I looking at this? What was the outcome of this? How are we going to find benefits for this? And mostly building up a profile where I would be invited by the communities to do this sort of work instead of me going out there knocking on people's doors saying, I want to do this. Is it okay? I would be invited. And sometimes it's a bit of both. So it's just a great way to see how we can work with the communities and they guide the outcomes of this stuff. Now, initially, it was just like, this is fun. I'm going to just go charging around all excited and smiley and naive. And the elders had a certain amount of patience with me for that. But after a while, it's sort of like, all right, let's focus on what we need because this is our knowledge. So what can you do? What can we do together to get something really positive out of this? We'll reset the outcomes. And I bring my knowledge of astronomy and my expertise in the academic side of doing research and analysis. I never consider myself an expert on Indigenous or Aboriginal knowledge, of course. But how can I take what I've learned, the methodologies, the frameworks, the academic rigor, and apply that to figuring this stuff out? And it is so much fun. I love what I do.
Absolutely.
It can be a challenge.
So with that then, how do you get your foot in that door? How do you gain their trust, I guess? Because the Indigenous community has been, I guess, taken for a ride so many times that they get a bit wary of letting people in who aren't part of their community. How did you get into their community and get their trust?
So, during my PhD, I didn't actually work with any communities. I came from a physics background. I didn't come from an ethnographic background. And we just said, well, look, there's not enough time for me to be trained up in how to do all of that within the framework of the PhD. So my PhD was mostly what we call ethnohistory and archaeology. But I began working with elders, not really working with, just sort of like having a mentorship, and they would take me to sites and teach me things and gradually sort of educate this sort of, naive American charging through the door. And then after I finished my PhD, I got my very first job at UNSW, and I was working for Professor Martin Nakata. He's the one who invited me to meet with him for lunch. He offered me a job, and he guided everything. And we sat down, and we put together a whole strategic plan about the future of this discipline. And Martin Nakata is a Torres Strait Islander academic, the first islander to earn a PhD in Australia. Very famous for his theoretical work on the cultural interface. He's written a number of phenomenal books, and he's at the moment a deputy vice chancellor at JCU up in Townsville. But the way at that point, we're starting to work with communities, which we think of, academic positions, sort of postdoctoral world. That took a lot more, real consideration with how we went about this. And I didn't do it, and I didn't just sort of go up knocking on people's doors for that sort of thing. That was working for Martin Nakata, deciding to put together this project in the Torres Strait, for which I received a DECRA, and then he and I, me going up to the Torres Strait with him. And one of the things that was really different about our relationship when we went to the community is normally the islanders and Aboriginal communities are used to seeing these sort of white academics, which, the archaeologists and the anthropologists in particular, they would have this phrase called, here come the anthros, or here come the archaeos. And it's just this never-ending procession of academic, archaeologists and anthropologists who come in wanting to do all these things with their hands out, wanting to take knowledge and go off and make their careers, but never give back. And oftentimes that knowledge be used against the communities. So it was one of those things where, like, no, we've got to change this. We don't want to work with it. Yeah. And Martin grew up in the Torres Strait. So what we did when we went to the island is I was his shadow. I was like mouth shut, ears open, and I wasn't the first one charging through. That's what they're used to. They're used to the white academic being the one who runs around, being the first, and everybody else is sort of trailing behind. That whole dynamic was flipped. And not just because he wanted to flip it, because that's how it really was. He's a senior academic. He's a hell of a lot smarter than I am. Like, it was a natural progression, but people saw that. There were optics involved in that, and they saw that I wasn't the overly loud, annoying, brash American that I could be.
You weren't the young upstart.
Yeah, exactly. And that relationship took a while, but it takes years to build those relationships.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now I can call the elders over there and have a chat with them. But there was a couple years it took for me to go up there, and before people really opened up.
For those who are listening on the podcast with no video, I'm nodding my head, just bobbing up and down, because what Dwayne is telling us is just so interesting. So Dwayne, so you published a book earlier this year, The First Astronomers, How Indigenous Elders Read the Stars. So I think this sort of ties in with what we've just been discussing, but what was the drive to write this book in particular?
Well, this is something I sat down with Martin Ockton and worked out back in 2013. And we talked about the things we need to do to build up this space in Indigenous astronomy, looking at the big picture. And it's easy to get dragged into politics and quarrels, and you move universities and all these things happen. But it's always keeping your eye on the big picture. And one of the things that we talked about is how we need to educate the public to change the narrative. The narrative was a few narratives. Anything that you see in the media, it's changing now a bit, but it's still very much this way. Always something negative when it comes to Aboriginal culture, or whatever. It's always that sort of negative connotation with that, and the predominant myth in the public eye that these are just myths and legends. There's no real knowledge there. They're just stories. It's astrology. It's mysticism. It's whatever. And so the idea of the book was to not only educate the public, to platform the elders so their voices were at the forefront, and do that on not only an Australian context but a global context. But the main focus of it was about the science of the Indigenous knowledge.
What gave you the idea? So, I actually haven't had a chance to read your book yet, so I'm sorry.
Oh,
I know. What was the
one?
He's going to read the whole book for us. For everyone listening, you can go to all good bookstores to get the book.
Absolutely.
And there is a professional audiobook as well of this.
Is there? Well, you know what? When this podcast goes up, I'll put links in the description for that. Send people there. That's for sure. And I know you spoke at the ASV Astro Talk in April, and it was the most popular Astro Talk we've had since quite a while before COVID. That's for sure. It was a full house. Over 100 people came to listen to you talk. And I think viewer-wise online, we on Facebook we clocked well over a few thousand. And on YouTube,
okay. Wow.
Yeah, YouTube we're closing in on 500 views on it for you. So it was a very popular talk. And my question is, it's not on our list of questions, but I want to know, how do you deal with the criticisms that you get? Like, well, it must grate on you when people are just like, it's just stories and it's not real. And my first thought on that is, well, the zodiac is, or Greek, the Greek symbols in the sky that we see. There's no difference really to me. That was their star law that evolved into science. So how is this?
There was no distinction between them prior to a few hundred years ago, really.
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
No, there's a lot of criticism comes in this space from all different angles across the spectrum. And there's certain types of criticism that I handle very well, and I'm kind of happy with that. So if somebody comes to me and says, this is rubbish, I'm like, all right, let's go. I can do it. Let's talk about it. You think it's rubbish? Okay, well, let's go. What? And then we'll have this discussion about it. And then it usually boils down to people conflating old traditions with sort of religious creationism.
Yeah.
And they're completely different. They're nothing alike. The whole dynamic and power structure behind them are different. The indigenous knowledges are not dogmatic. There's so many things I can talk about in that space, which is why I'd love at some point to sit down and have a real great with Richard Dawkins or I forgot his name off the top of my head. I actually met him a couple of times. Lawrence Krauss and those who just want to sit there and be like, oh, this is just all creationism and mysticism. I'm like, no, it is not. You've got to understand so many things that tie in with that, especially about the nature of orality. But some of these people just aren't interested in listening to that. So there's criticism from that side. There's criticism from certain areas of academia because, and I just talk openly about this. I'm probably not making a lot of friends when I do it. I actually thought that I was going to have a very difficult time convincing the scientific community, particularly the astronomy and physics communities, about this. But the social science and humanities communities would get it. And what I found overall, and it's not always the case, I still find people in physics who think it's, rubbish. And I still get lots of people in anthropology and archaeology and the social sciences who love this work. But I did notice this sort of bell curve trend that was exactly opposite of what I thought. So the astronomy community embraced it. We're happy with that. And I, 10 years after being at a conference at Melbourne Uni in physics, where people were sort of talking about how ridiculous it was, 10 years later, I'm an A prof in physics at Melbourne Uni doing this.
Absolutely.
I did not see that coming at all.
Yeah.
But then I found that a lot of the social science community weren't as accepting of it. And I've got hypotheses on why that might be the case. And one of them that I think, and I'll get a lot of criticism for this, and I very well could be wrong. And the anthros and archaeos probably come and kick me right square in the backside. They're probably right. But I notice a difference in the way that the physics community, including astros, everything is culturally embedded. How we do our research, what we do, the outcomes of that, not necessarily. But how we apply for grants, who gets to publish what to go for, all those kinds of things. But we stand by what the evidence shows us. And it doesn't necessarily matter if somebody in a particular position says something. If you can disprove them, in reality, it doesn't quite work that easily. When I was publishing all this research over the years, I was really targeting the astro community because I figured, well, not only these are my people, but they're the ones I thought I was going to have to convince. Yeah. And I know the language, so I knew how to write to the astro community and what things to talk about. So 10 years on, 14 years on, the astro community loves it. We're incorporating it into all the ARC centers of excellence, schools. I'm teaching Indigenous Astronomy through the School of Physics. We're embedding it across the board. It's phenomenal. Yeah. Go to the social sciences, and it's just sort of like there's a big wall there. And part of that, I think, maybe excluding archaeology a bit, the others are much more qualitative, and it is about who gets to say what. Mm-hmm. And I think oftentimes, a lot of the times, I'm not seen as an anthropologist, an archaeologist, a sociologist, a social scientist. I'm seen as an astronomer masquerading as one. Yeah. Whereas in physics, because I have that foundational training, they still accept me as a physicist. Okay, yeah, my PhD might have been a little bit left field, but they still see that. Yeah. So, that's kind of how I felt. But then I also get criticism because I'm a white American guy working in Indigenous studies. And, I understand the historical context of why that can be a challenge, and that's why I try to be very cautious about what I do, how I approach it. I understand what I am, who I am, and the power structures involved in that. But at the end of the day, the work has to be done. The work needs to be done. The elders, the communities are crying for this to be done. And we don't have a long queue of Aboriginal astrophysicists standing in line for this to happen. There's several in training, and we're getting more people involved in that. We're building momentum because that's been a big part of why we're doing all of this. There's only one PhD astrophysicist who's Aboriginal I know of. That's Stacy Mader. He's a radio astronomer at the CSIRO. He works out at Parkes Radio Telescope. But 20-odd years, and that's been the only one. Now we've got Kirsten Banks and Carly Noon and Crystal Dinopoli and Pete Swanton and Peter Reeve who've come and done their undergrads, and now they're doing honors, masters, PhDs and stuff. We've got that whole generation. So it is shifting. But, yeah, I can still cop a lot of stuff from all of that. And, there are times that I have no problem handling it. And there are times I've over the last 2 years writing this book, I will publicly say I've been in many offices of psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors, therapists trying to get through this, and it has not been easy by any stretch. I don't want to sit here and, oh, poor woe with me.
When I was an undergrad, there was absolutely no mention of any sort of cultural astronomy. It was very much just, we study quantum physics and we talk about dudes from the 19th century and things. And so just like the speed at which, this knowledge is sort of getting out there and actually being, you may have different insider sort of views on it, but as someone who works in astronomy but not in your field, it really feels like these ideas are actually being considered seriously, when I would say a decade ago they just weren't even considered at all, let alone seriously or unseriously.
Well, exactly right. And that conference I went to was an ASA conference at Melbourne Uni in 2009. Yeah. That was my first time in Melbourne, and I was, there was nobody really giving me a hard time, but it was a funny situation with the posters. Because I came to that conference and presented 2 posters on Aboriginal astronomy. And where the posters were I think they were in the first year labs, they were set up like cubicles instead of just being flat walls. So what you could do is you could put a poster up and then stand on the other side and eavesdrop. And I noticed a very distinct trend. I was hearing positive feedback and I was hearing negative criticism. And they were distinctly correlated to accent. The Australian accents were like, this is a waste of time, this is stupid, they didn't have anything. And the non-Australian accents were all like, oh, this is interesting, this is cool. But I got challenged by people who were like, oh, are you an anthropologist? Why are you using these terms? We use these terms in physics, and that's not what it means. I'm like, yeah, you don't own all of these terms.
Yeah. Yep.
But what we're seeing now is there is a huge shift in all of this, and now we're building world-class, cultural astronomy programs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Working on, Astro 3D's got gender parity, and we're working on these things happening. And what I think is important, I don't know if I should say this in the public forum. I don't see anything wrong with it.
We can edit it out. It's fine.
When I was appointed at Melbourne Uni, it was a direct appointment. I didn't apply for the position.
Yeah.
But before they hired me, they had a staff meeting, and all of the full-time continuing academics had to unanimously agree for me to come into this position. So this wasn't like 1 or 2 people wanted me there and there were a bunch of people who didn't, and this sort of thing happening. And from what I was told, it was unanimous. Like everybody there was happy for me to come and bring this. So that speaks volumes for Melbourne Uni, for the School of Physics. And it shows that an institution that's got a, let's not beat around the bush, a pretty dodgy past with a lot of things. It's making some real progress in areas that it needs to. So, I think if I were to be in a department or a school that most closely aligns to what I'm doing, I'd actually be in the history and philosophy of science.
Yeah.
But, my appointment in physics not only draws from my foundational training in physics, but it's also strategic.
Yes,
because
absolutely.
The university wants, or the people who make the decisions in this space, want the people working in the indigenous space in particular to be threaded throughout the university, not all stuck in one place where a new VC or dean or whomever can just come along one day when the belt gets a bit tight and goes, you're going, It ensures longevity, and that's part of it. And of course I'm not indigenous, but we're building up this space and we're paving the way. So in the future, whether it's a few years or even 10 years from now, we're going to have a whole load of people coming into this space who are indigenous from Australia and from around the world. That's my goal and my hope, and that's what we're trying to work for.
Absolutely.
So speaking of Melbourne Uni, then what is a typical day at university like for you then?
Well, there's no such thing as a typical day. It can be a bit overwhelming. So
there's a statistical average.
And then just divide it up. What would a fairly, not always typical, but what's a day in the life of Dwayne at Melbourne Uni like?
5,000 emails, trying to get through those each day with an overwhelming mountain of stuff. It's just sort of, you're trying to just knock it down bit by bit. The mountain just gets bigger as time goes on. You're able to pull a few things off. Now, so there's the teaching, which I'm teaching Indigenous Astronomy, developing new courses in archaeoastronomy and dark sky studies. and history of astronomy that's already there. So we're building these big programs. Lots of PhD students coming in from all across the shop. I've got PhD students in psychology, astronomy, design, physics now.
Yeah.
All across the place, doing the research, which is my favorite part of all of it, which is always new stuff we're getting involved in. And the stuff in psychology, why are particular constellations or groups of stars seen by different cultures in such similar ways?
Yeah.
So we're applying like mathematical psychology and perception studies. Torres Strait, we're going through the dozens and dozens of hours of interviews I have with all the elders and starting to piece together this huge encyclopedia of star knowledge. We're looking at old traditions that go back 13,000 years based on rising seas and the positions of stars, due to precession. An endless stream of research. There's all the program building, but really the biggest thing for me is I've got a lot of irons and a lot of fires over there. So I'm constantly meeting with colleagues in different schools and faculties, building up these programs, getting grants going, meeting with students, sort of whining and dining colleagues, doing everything we can to build this stuff up. But then the outreach becomes a massive component of that.
Yeah. And
the numbers of interviews, podcasts, public talks, and stuff. I love my job, but there are times it can be a little bit overwhelming. But
yes,
in a very, very positive way.
We're really glad you managed to come and chat with us, because this has been an amazing chat so far. I don't know if this is used, but so as well as Melbourne Uni, I also work at a few different places around Melbourne. I work at ScienceWorks and Victorian Space Science Education Centre, and definitely I've talked about you to my colleagues at those places, and they're like, "Oh yeah, Dwayne, we want him to come and do a talk, or we want him to come and chat with us about this sort of thing, or we've got an idea that we want to run by him." So definitely you're everywhere. Basically, everyone wants you to come and work with them. So it's great that there's lots of students coming in to sort of take on some of that load.
Yeah, there's quite a few from all different walks of life coming in. Yeah. It's really phenomenal. In fact, I live in Yarraville, right by the Westgate Bridge. In fact, I can practically see that way. I can almost see. Yep. So we're hoping to get students from my courses into the planetarium in a couple weeks.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're trying to, maybe Crystal Donopoli and I doing a book event or something, a combined book event. Like, these are all things we're trying to get in the pipeline, and getting students excited is my favorite thing. And yesterday was awesome, because I brought in a shoe swap shaman from Canada. He does a lot of things, and he's artist, filmmaker, but he's trained as a shaman, and he trained for 30 years from the Council of 25 Grandmothers. Mm-hmm. So he took the class and took them outside in a courtyard, grassy area where I got a really nice sunburn on the back of my neck.
Oh no!
Genuine redneck, and more than one way now. And
double redneck.
Led them through a medicine wheel ceremony. And taught them what everything meant as they were going through it, the connections to the stars, but also a chance for the students to really get a multi-sensory experience, because they're outside, and he's teaching everybody how to connect with the land, with the sky, to listen to the birds and the animals, listen to the wind. There was plenty of wind. And it's one of these things where you 10 years ago, if you just said, there's going to be a physics course where they're going to be outside with a shaman in full regalia passing around burning sage, and the students are going to stand up and pray to the four winds. You'd think, are you out of your mind? I mean, I did this last year in the courtyard of the physics building, and the number of looks like God were like, what is going on? And that's why 2 weeks later I gave a seminar called Shamans or Science, What the Hell's Going On in Physics? And I actually gave a seminar where I explained to them, well, I can stand here and talk about the medicine wheel ceremony, but I have no connection to that. We can bring somebody in who can take them outside and lead them through that experience, teach them what's going on. They're outside the sterile lecture hall, and they get to go out and really get a feel for it. And it was amazing. Last year was a student's favorite subject, and yesterday, I've never had that many students in my lecture at once. And they loved it. It was really phenomenal. So they got a chance to really let their passion for what they're learning in this course and why they took the course. They didn't take the course and listen to me crack on for an hour, which quite easily. But a lot of the students, they do say it's their favorite subject, and I want to keep that excitement and that passion going. And I know I need to get them to the planetarium, to the observatory, get them outside, and that's how we're going to accomplish that.
Yeah, that's amazing. You said I think even just going outside for a shoot would be unthinkable, I think, in most physics courses. But so changing their environment, getting them outside, connected to this ancient, I'm just, my mind is boggling.
That's one of the big questions. It's not the same for you guys. I'll take it slightly off topic. It's a lot of the astrophotographers that I am friends with, they'll all say to me, you're using your phone. Why don't you hook a camera up to it and plug a computer, and then you can sit inside and run a script, and And I'm like, but sitting out under the stars, the last 2 nights weren't meant to be clear skies, and they were. And I sat out there until 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, clicking my little Bluetooth clicker with my phone attached to the telescope every 30 seconds. And in between, I'm staring up at the stars with the binoculars, looking around and seeing stuff and experiencing. And it's not just the night sky I'm experiencing. It's everything around me. In suburbia, you can hear the traffic going past. I can hear the possums and watch the possums running along the fence line, and seeing a bat fly over, and just soaking in the nighttime environment while I'm doing astrophotography. It's a very different experience than going, plug everything in, it's polar aligned, here's my script, I'll go and sit inside and watch TV. I think getting out into the environment and experiencing it is so important, no matter what you're doing.
It is. That's my favorite. My favorite part of the job is going on country. I get to go to conferences, travel the world, but getting to go out to these places, and when the elders take you someplace, you realize how privileged you are.
Absolutely.
And they're explaining something to you, and you take your shoes off and you let your feet connect. You take a few minutes when you go to a place and just sit down and let nature around you connect with you. You don't just charge in, start unloading everything. You just tread softly, you sit down, you let everything around you connect and understand that you're there. They get to feel your presence, and you notice that from wildlife, and you notice your own personal connection. I'm an atheist. I'm not a terribly spiritual person at all, but for me, this is a spiritual experience when I get to go out. When I sit out like you're doing, sitting out under the stars by a campfire, I love that more than anything. Yep. I don't care if I'm collecting data, if I'm recording stuff. I'm not thinking about grants and publications. That's in the back of my mind eating away. But to hell with all of that. That's not why I do it. I do it because I want to be out there. I want to be connecting. That's the passion we have. That's why we do, or at least why I do what I do. I think it's why both of you do what you do. And it can get cold. It can get dark. That's what I love. So for me, that's my favorite part of the whole job, and seeing these places and getting a feel for it and learning things I didn't know, experiencing things in a new way. When we were sitting out in the grass, I just remember closing my eyes. I could smell the sage. I had my hands on the grass, and I was like, I don't want to move from this spot. I don't want to go inside with another freaking Zoom meeting. Sorry. Go in and work on another grant. I want to go in and sit on LMS and code stuff for the next couple
Yep.
I want to be out here doing this because this is what's connecting me. This is what reminds me why I do what I do and why I'm here, not sitting in my office droning away. And here I am droning away because I can do that very effectively.
So, what's the most interesting thing you've been involved in relating to your field of work? So we talked about, what excited you or what got you into the field in the first place, but that not necessarily is that the most interesting thing because, there's that spark of excitement, but, there's, the things that you sort of follow through because they...
So there was this time that he would use his 40-inch telescope.
Well, they all those experiences that I could name to answer that question all tie around one theme: meteorites.
Oh yeah,
tie around that. Yeah, meteorite. I've meteorites, meteors, impact craters. That's probably my favorite fields of study.
I would not have guessed you would say that.
When I started my PhD, that was the very first paper the first 3 papers I ever published were on that. I published like 10 papers on this topic in various capacities over the years. And in fact, I'm going on sabbatical in October to the University of Heidelberg, as I mentioned, to the Center of Apocalyptic and Post-Apocalyptic Studies, studying meteorite impacts in the end of the world. So I've gone out to the Central Desert a few times now, and they've all been phenomenal experiences. One was when I was reading this tradition about a star that fell out of the sky and hit the ground in Palm Valley. And on Google Maps, I noticed a very circular bowl-shaped structure. It looked like an escarpment, but it also looked quite distinct. So a colleague of mine named Craig O'Neill, we got permission from the Land Council. He took his PhD student and my partner at the time, and the 4 of us got into his old 4x4, and we drove from Sydney to the other side of Alice Springs, 36 hours. We camped out for a few days and surveyed the site, and then drove back. And I had hallucinations on the drive back. No sleep for a day and a half. It was middle of the night. I was smashing snakes and redwoods. I'm driving behind this truck, and I'm just hearing things that aren't there and seeing flashes that aren't there. And Craig at one point just sort of looking at me like, "You all right?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm fine. A couple years later, I went back out there with Craig again for a Meteoritic Society field trip, and I got lost in the bush with an older guy who didn't speak English. He was Czech. He was also deaf and mute, and was wearing sandals and shorts in spin effects country. So communication for us was a little bit of a challenge. We got lost out there for 2 or 3 hours in the desert, but I used my knowledge of navigation. Well, we used it, to work our way back, and we finally found the road, and we were jumping up and down, hugging, almost crying, and his legs were I thought we were going to die. So I talk about that story in the book. But then the more recent, I went out there a couple of years later and filmed a Nat Geo documentary on the story of God with Morgan Freeman, and we were at Norala, which is Goss's Bluff crater, and filming this segment, which I was definitely overacting big time. But it was a lot of fun learning firsthand from Warren Williams, one of the traditional custodians there, about the site and what it meant. And we're sitting there on camera learning new things from each other about this while cameras are rolling. So those were 3 experiences in the desert. And then a couple of years ago, the more recent one was a Werner Herzog documentary called Fireballs, Visitors from Darker Worlds. It was Werner Herzog and Clive Oppenheimer, who's a Cambridge geologist. And we went to Mare in the Torres Strait to film this Mayer, the shooting star fireball dance. And it almost didn't happen. Werner had to go off to LA because he got sick when he was out at Wolf Creek Crater. He didn't get killed by a sadistic murder, but he had to go back there. And then there was a miscommunication, and the whole thing almost went belly up. Tens and tens and tens of thousands of dollars a year in planning, all this fieldwork gear, everything, cameras, and it almost didn't happen. But I had a chat with one of the elders, and they pulled it together. They got 4 dancers who were working. They got off at noon. We had to perform the dance at sunset. So we had a few hours. So on camera for this major film, these 4 dancers are learning the Mayer, the shooting. And they actually do it on camera for the first time. It's the first time that dance had been performed on the island where it's from since 1969. So
wow.
Past.
That's amazing.
That's the video you showed us.
It was gorgeous. The cinematography was wonderful. Uncle Alok Tapim came through. Ava Noah came through. They got a big community group down there singing and dancing and performing it. And that scene actually concludes the documentary. And that day was just stressful beyond imagination, but it came through so beautifully. So if you get a chance to see that documentary, it's called Fireball, Visitors from Darker Worlds. It's on Apple TV Plus, and that's the very last scene in the film. It's phenomenal.
So that's the video you showed at the ASV, your talk with the ASV.
I think I had my camera in the background. I was showing part of that while they were filming.
Yeah. That was amazing to see.
Out of the way.
Absolutely amazing to see that was. I was reading your bio when I was looking you up to see what sort of questions we should ask you, and I saw something on there about UNESCO. and that you're a heritage expert for UNESCO. How the heck does that happen? How do you become a heritage expert for UNESCO?
Oh, that's a little bit less exciting than it might seem. or not. Maybe it is very exciting. I'm just downplaying it.
It's not the sort of thing you see every
inside
day.
knowledge about what happens at the UNESCO, eyes wide shut parties or whatever happens, No, it's not like that. Now, what happened is a few years ago, there was a big committee and conference on astronomical heritage and danger and sites around the world that needed UNESCO. The UNESCO World Heritage classification was one of the ways that you could help safeguard some of these sites. So we were looking at, people were coming in and talking about various sites from around the world. And there's the big ones people know about. There's the pyramids and Meta Playa and Göbekli Tepe and Stonehenge, all these other places, and some of the lesser known places around the world. And we had this big conference, and we exchanged ideas about ways we could do this and talked about what it all could mean. And this was all in the Canary Islands, by the way. And one of the discussions that came out of that was, when you're working with traditional communities, UNESCO heritage for archaeological sites where those cultures are long gone, more or less, is one thing. Working with living cultures can be very tricky, and UNESCO heritage might not be something you want to do, because when it's there, then it's set. You can't touch it. You're not supposed to change it. It's like getting a heritage house here and you want to renovate. Yeah, it's not going to happen. Yeah. And the elders are like, we don't need some UNESCO committee in Paris to tell us what we can do with our sites.
Yeah.
So we're trying to work on ways that we can help manage what the community wants, but also knowing that certain avenues are going to have a lot of power and clout behind them. It's going to be hard for a mining company to destroy a site of its UNESCO heritage, which, the fish traps out in Western Victoria at, my brain's frying today. I just got out of jiu-jitsu, so I'm still, brain's a little fried today. But them. So that's been UNESCO World Heritage listed. So, there are real benefits to that. So there's a lot happening. The whole thing about getting, being a UNESCO thing, they invited me because of the work that we do in this particular space.
Heritage Advisor for UNESCO. I mean, that's a pretty cool thing to be invited to do. It really is.
It is, and the work you're doing contributes to this larger movement to help safeguard these sites, and that you get to be one of the people who helps make the decisions on ensuring that these places, which were left derelict or in threat of danger, are now going to be safeguarded in the indefinite future. And doing that, and the ones that I've been really honored to be part of, in some ways proud, it seems weird saying proud, but have been the IAU working group on star names. We actually, the small group of us, go in and we officiate formal names for all the stars in the sky.
Yeah.
And, there are problems with that as well. But we've successfully had 7 different stars that now formally have Aboriginal names from different language groups. There's Wachibala Wurgaya language, there's the Wataman language, there's the Bunurong language, there's the Gamilaroi Uwalye language. There's an exoplanet that has a Bunurong name. So, and there's asteroids. There's a handful of asteroids that are named after communities and elders and academics who are all, Aboriginal and Torres Strait.
Just that, like you're saying, the stars being named, the asteroids and that, and it is filtering into society. When you look at things like Melbourne Football Club are renaming themselves for the Indigenous round over and I think that's great.
One of the things I love about physics is that we're all different people, and people just have their own different interests. So when you're finished for the day, what do you do to unwind? We've already talked a little bit about drumming, but anything else that you do that you'd like to tell us about?
Well, the reason I was a little bit late is I train in judo and jiu-jitsu, so that's why I love spending my time doing, getting on the mat and rolling. I mean, I've been training in martial arts for 25 years now, and I did a lot of stuff over the years, but since I moved to Australia, I've focused mostly on judo and jiu-jitsu, been having a blast with that. I've taken over managing my band because they weren't getting much done, so now we're getting some gigs booked, recording singles, getting the album done, and it's great. I mean, I love obviously playing acoustic drums, but buying a really good, high-quality electronic drum kit with the sensitive pads that can measure every variation in your hit, you can record things. I can record drums in my office, and I can go on because you record as a MIDI and make sure everything is good instead of spending a huge amount of time and effort trying to go into a studio doing it. So that's what's been sticking a lot of my time now. It's been judo, jiu-jitsu, drumming, the band, but also just trying to get out in nature a bit. And my partner's art practice has been heavily involved in helping with all of that in various capacities. I love taking photos and being the film guy and being the gopher, as we call it. Go for this, go for that.
What does the future hold for you?
Well, my sabbatical is going to be fun. That's going to be almost a year, Heidelberg, studying meteorite impacts in the end of the world. That shaman that I'm working with is developing a documentary series that'll be numerous seasons, numerous episodes, and I'm going to be one of the main people involved in that. That's going to be really exciting. So there's a lot of things happening. We got a new dark sky study subject we're going to have at the university. So we're going to have all 3 levels, first, second, and third year. Indigenous astronomy, archaeoastronomy, and history of astronomy, and then safeguarding dark skies.
Oh, that sounds
class
amazing.
we're going to have as a whole breadth stream in science. We're going to tie that in with a couple of subjects in social sciences and make a minor out of that for BA students. So we're building up these programs here. Putting all of this on a global stage has been the point from day one, which is why I've never been happy staying in one spot or just focusing locally. This is a global thing, and we're making things happen across the board, keeping that momentum going, building up the new generation of students, particularly the First Nations students in this space, on a global scale again. And we just put in for a major grant on something with the European Research Council with 2 very close colleagues in the U.S. and Scotland, Jarita Holbrook, who's an African-American astrophysicist, and Annette Lee, who's a Lakota astrophysicist. And it ties in with this space on diversity and inclusion in the astrophysics world. So we're really excited about all the things that are going to be coming up in the next few years. So it's just onwards and upwards at Astra.
We're up to the fun part.
This is
something we do at the end of every quiz, and Steffi's not been involved in one of these.
This is my first time too.
First one as well. But we like to do a thing called Spot Quiz.
Bring
your
it on.
topic, so 5 questions, and your topic. So, as I said, the idea of this is to show or to get the listeners to understand that while you have some great skills in areas that you've studied really hard in, as smart as you are and as smart as we all are, not everyone is smart at everything. So we're going to try and stump you with some questions.
How are you going to feel if I answer these right?
I've got the answers. I've got the
I'm not that smart. Yeah, I know that.
and the topic is donkeys.
You want to hear something funny before you go on? Before you go on?
Yeah.
The very first university I attended was Central Missouri State University, and their mascots, because all American universities have mascots, were the mules and the jennies.
Oh, this will be good then. So just so you know, I think from memory doesn't. It's been a while since we've done one of these. I'm pretty sure the highest score at the moment is 2.5 out of 5. So that's what you're going for. You got to get above that. Now, the first few only got 1 out of 5. So they're not easy, these topics, when we cover these off. But Steffi, you're first up with the first question.
I'm first up, yes. First question. So, there are 3 main types of donkeys: wild, feral, and domesticated. How big do donkeys grow in centimeters?
How tall or how long?
How big?
I think
big?
tall. How tall?
I would say
so what we're talking is from the hoof to the shoulder.
Donkeys are about 150 centimeters.
Very close.
I was thinking 140, but I went to 150. But
do you want me to read out the answer?
Yeah,
Yes.
read out the answer.
So wild donkeys typically go to around 49 inches, as you're American, 125 centimeters from hoof to shoulder. But domesticated donkeys are slightly smaller, typically only 36 to 48 inches, so 92 to 123 centimeters from hoof to shoulder. So I think adding in their, the head on top of that, you're probably getting
thinking the head, not the shoulder.
150.
Yeah,
So
do we give him a half a point?
I would give him a full point, honestly.
All right, you can have the full point, because if you go to the head, I think you're right, 140.
You didn't give me the boundary conditions.
We did not. So we have to be generous with our marking.
Question 2. Name 3 places around the world where wild donkeys are found.
Mexico, Peru, and Australia.
Wrong, and wrong.
Scotland, France, and Korea. I don't know.
Northern Africa, from Morocco to Somalia, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Middle East.
All right.
Tibet, which is where the Tibetan wild ass is found. China, the northern parts of Pakistan, India, Nepal, and Bhutan, and that's it. Yeah, there we go. That's where they're found.
All right. Yeah, that makes sense.
1 out of 2.
Probably a bit easier, this question. So,
Yes.
and I'm not saying that to be a smartass and then give you a very hard question.
Don't get it wrong.
Can you name
Note
3
the
things?
use of the word ass in there.
I'm very clever. Can you name 3 things which donkeys need to eat to be healthy?
Donkeys need to eat
He's thinking.
apples, carrots, and grass.
That is perfect answer, I would say. So things like grass, straw, and hay, cereals generally, many trees and bushes, carrots and apples. But donkeys.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
You got it.
you got it. Perfect. Donkeys should not be offered meat products under any circumstances.
They're herbivores all the way.
I tell you what, when I'm thinking about it now, just thinking about it from the very first question of tonight to the topic of donkeys and still starting with the letter D, I'm glad we didn't choose the topic drums, because I reckon we would have lost this one big time. I thought about it, but I didn't go with it.
General knowledge would have won, so...
Yes, true. All right. What is the maximum weight that a donkey should carry?
I think donkeys, I know, are renowned for carrying a lot of weight, but it's very bad for them. So I would say donkeys probably shouldn't carry more than like 50 kilos or something.
You're very good at this. I think he's won already.
Give this one to you. 54 kilos.
54, okay. Well,
Yeah, you're well within it. I reckon that's within the tolerances there. He's on 3. I think you're clubhouse leader at the moment.
And you pointed out that, unfortunately, they're often asked to carry more, which can hurt their backs because they've got the little curvy back.
Last one.
Can you name any parasites which attack donkeys? And we want the full scientific species name. And no.
Full donkey computer. No, I won't Google. A parasite that attacks donkeys. I would probably say one of them would probably be like a hoof parasite. I have no idea what you would call a hooven parasite.
Probably fungus.
I don't know. Hoof shrooms. Donkeyus, hoofus, shroomus.
Thumbs down. Pretty basic ones, isn't it, Steffi?
Yeah, things like internal worms, especially we've got redworm and lungworm, and external parasites like tick slice and mange. And there's some horrible details that actually
Let's read the details.
All right. Internal worms may eat their way through the animal's tissues and cause internal bleeding, pain, and eventual death. External parasites usually feed off the animal's blood and can cause severe anemia and eventual death. So, not not very happy. Need to get.
It's not all sunshine and happiness on Spaghettification. There's definitely discussion in there as well.
And black holes.
I thought you wanted to know what the scientific name of a tapeworm. I'm like, I don't friggin' know. But
Yeah, no, that was a joke. Sorry.
Been tricky with that one. I think you might be Clubhouse leader. I'll have to.
That is
I'm gonna
amazing.
have to go back and listen to the other podcasts, but I think
I'm even willing to give him a half mark for that last one.
Well, Dwayne, I just want to say thank you very much for
Thank
joining
you so
us
much.
on Spaghettification. It has been a blast.
Yeah,
And I think I might sneak into a lecture or two. And I really do think that we should get your students up to the Dark Sky site. I think they'd have a blast up there. So let's see if we can try and organise that.
Yeah, I wanted to say, Duane, thank you for sharing some of your amazing stories. My face is hurting because I've been smiling so much. So,
I really appreciate it. It's awesome. I know we don't get much of a I don't get much of a chance to talk to anybody that isn't a student, but it's great chatting with both of you and sharing this stuff. And I didn't expect to spend a couple of hours after jiu-jitsu doing this, but I'm really glad I did. It's a lot of fun. I really enjoy it.
There you go. We've ended it on a nice note for you.
Thanks for listening and supporting us as we continue to learn on our podcast journey. If you would like to contribute to the podcast, you can head to www.patreon.com/Spaghettification podcast and support us for as little as 1 can of beer a day. Shout out to Steve from Homeline ZZ, Jess Stout, and Paul Milvain and Andy Latta for their ongoing support.